Welcome to True Crime and Coke. I am your host, Eve, and this podcast is about true crime, disappearances, conspiracies, hauntings, and anything strange or unusual, all while drinking an excessive amount of Diet Coke. If you have a story to share, I would love to hear and feature it on a future episode. Just email me at truecrimeandcoke@gmail.com and put which category it is in the subject line. If you enjoy this podcast and want it to continue, please rate me 5 stars, tell your friends about me, and consider supporting me on Patreon under True Crime and Coke. Now that that's out of the way, let's begin. Hi, this is Eve. Welcome to part 4 of my 5th podcast, and it will be the ending of episode 5, so I'll move on to other stuff other than horrible child killers, which more will be in future episodes because there's so many of them. And today we are going to talk about Canada's first boogeyman, Clifford Olson. So let's begin. Even before the sex killers Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo and the infamous pig farmer Robert Pickton, there was this guy. This was back in 1980, but at that time Vancouver was just truly a provincial city. Expo 86 was 6 years away, and newspapers from other provinces or countries still could take days to arrive. The lower mainland was a patchwork quilt just of municipalities. So I'm cutting in here just to pretty much sum up that horrible paragraph to say the police didn't communicate with each other. There was so many random jurisdictions and whatever that they couldn't communicate, and at that time there was no computer for them to be able to keep track of and keep data in, so this enabled Olson to get away with murder and get away with it for so long. Hitchhikers disappeared from the highways, and telephone poles had posters warning that nearly a dozen youngsters were missing and that a killer was on the loose. The once safe area that boasted that they could keep their doors unlocked was no longer safe. Clifford Olson was born on January 1st, 1940. He was a New Year's Day baby. He was the eldest child of Clifford and Leona. His dad delivered milk in those days and was one of the last to drive a horse-drawn cart. Later, Clifford Sr. worked in construction and as an apartment building manager, and Leona was a housekeeper. After the war, the family moved to the suburb of Richmond into one of the many housing schemes for returning veterans. A short, stocky kid, Olson was always a problem. He was always getting into fights and getting beaten up, his father, Clifford Olson Sr., remembered later. One day he said, "Dad, I'm going to learn how to box." As soon as he did, he began making the rounds of the boys who had beaten him up and started evening the score. Maybe that's his trouble, that chip on his shoulder. He began to skip class when he was only 10 years old, and after completing 8th grade, he quit altogether to embrace a life of crime. Leona, his mother, bore 2 more sons, Richard and Dennis. Clifford Olson's brothers and sister grew up to be law-abiding citizens, but his mother always had excuses for Clifford. But he was a loner, a loser, and a failure. He was jailed for the first time on July 19th, 1957, at age 17. Over the following 24 years, he chalked up nearly 100 convictions: obstructing justice, possession of stolen property, possession of firearms, forgery, false pretenses, fraud, parole violation, impaired driving, theft, break and enter and theft, armed robbery, escape from lawful custody, rape, buggery, gross indecency, and finally, first-degree murder. He escaped jail 7 times. Serving 3.5 years in the BC penitentiary for break-and-enter theft, Olsen fled 3 guards who had escorted him to Shawnahessie Hospital after he faked an illness. The chase involved dozens of police, and at one point the armed and dangerous Olsen slipped through a closing net of investigators in Vancouver's East End by only seconds. He spent that night hiding under the Queensborough Bridge in New Westminster. After a week on the loose, Olsen was nabbed in Blainwash, sniffed out by Tiger, the police dog. Border Patrol officers had called for assistance after Olsen menaced 2 teens with a gun in a wooded area straddling the international boundary, about a 1/4 mile east of the Pacific Highway crossing. Officers from 4 different forces were involved in the final moments of the chase for the 25-year-old fugitive. He must have lain there in the leaves 3 hours with 50 people crisscrossing right through there, said Chief Border Inspector A.D. Brandon at the time. But the dog went straight to him. It was the second time Olsen had been caught by a police dog. Roughly a year earlier, he was pinned in a thorny tangle of Richmond blackberry bushes by a dog named Renty. Olsen was freed under mandatory supervision 5 times in the 1970s, and each time his behavior landed him back behind bars. Released in January of 1980, Olsen picked up where he left off and continued his lifelong crime spree. It was all he knew how to do. A few months after getting out of prison, Olsen seduced Joan Hell, a local divorcee who had survived a violent, abusive marriage. They had a son, Stephen, in April of 1981, and this was in the midst of Olsen's killing spree. And they married a month later. 3 days after the ceremony, Olsen murdered another teenager. Hell said she knew nothing of the crimes and presented herself at the time as a victim. In fact, Olsen lived off her divorce settlement and abused her, too, she said. The police investigation of Olsen, one of Canada's first serial killer cases, was heavily criticized because he was able to kill again and again, even after detectives identified him as the prime suspect. Olsen was able to initially elude detection in part because of his reputation as a rat. The cops at first thought of him a resource, not a suspect, and they had some reason. In 1976, inside Prince Albert Penitentiary, Olsen was stabbed 7 times by a gang of prisoners angry after he betrayed and identified for authorities prison drug couriers. While incarcerated, Olsen also provided police with enough information to ensure the conviction of a fellow inmate who raped, mutilated, and strangled a 9-year-old girl. Olsen, who was always revved up on alcohol and pills, had a standard routine to lure adolescents. He met them in video parlors and similar youth hangouts, or he advertised for them on the bulletin board of the People's Full Gospel Church, which was a Baptist congregation where he and Joan worshipped. Olsen handed out a flashy 3D card that identified him as a construction contractor. Under the guise of conducting a brief informal job interview, he identified his potential victims. He sought out the naive. He'd hold out the prospect of a job, give them a ride to a fictitious construction site, and, along the way, offer them a celebratory sip of a Mickey Finn, which was a pop or a bottled cocktail, but it was spiked with chloral hydrate, a knockout drug. Once he overpowered the youngster, Olsen engaged in sadistic experiments on the children. He drove a 3-inch spike into one child's head. Another he injected with an air embolism. He talked about them as science experiments and fantasized about fame under the name Silver Hammer Man, a reference to the Beatles song. Olsen scattered their bodies from the bogs and cranberry fields of the Fraser River Delta to the abandoned quarries and canyons of the coastal mountains. He randomly picked his victims from a similarly large swath of the lower mainland, so the lack of coordination among regional police departments in the RCMP worked to his advantage. The career criminal had honed his awareness of police procedures. When distraught parents initially complained about police inaction and to speculate the existence of a serial killer, investigators downplayed such fears. They insisted that the teens were likely just running away. It took investigators a long time to link disappearances that occurred in different jurisdictions. In the end, however, even the police were forced to acknowledge the obvious as the number of disappeared neared double digits. At the investigation's peak, more than 200 officers were committed to the case. The pressure on police and politicians to find the children and the perpetrator was intense. It was fueled by frenzied media coverage. "Cunning killer with blazing eyes," shouted one headline. "Hot summer helps slayer elude police," trumpeted another. A later inquiry identified many problems with the police response to the disappearance and killings. It recommended various independent police departments join in the use of the RCMP computer, the establishment of a central data bank, and a review of RCMP procedures for handling multi-jurisdictional crimes. Nevertheless, 2 decades later, the lack of integration among lower mainland police agencies would remain a problem and be blamed as a contributing factor in the downtown East Side missing women case. When Olsen was actually arrested in mid-August 1981, the beast turned out to be a beefy rounder with cow orbs. He stood 5'7", weighed maybe 160 pounds, and had a mop of brown hair. Police, though, had scant evidence against him in only 4 bodies. During his interrogation, Olsen offered to lead police to the remains of the children who hadn't been found. He also said he would return some of the jewelry and clothing, which he had kept as souvenirs. Tapes of the interrogation sessions, notes from investigators, and later reminiscence provided a vivid, if unsettling, picture of what happened. In what later was to be called the cash for bodies still, a lot of changes were made into the law, and I'll tell you about those at the end. But what happened was Olsen told the interrogators that he'd give them 11 bodies for $100,000. Olsen said not only would he give them the bodies, but he would give them all the evidence, the things that only the killer would know. The detective was unsure as he could be ripped off and come up with nothing. So Olsen said that he'll give them a freebie. He said, "I'll give you 1 body and a statement. You have the $100,000 in cash. When we are finished at the scene, I will phone, or you will phone your man, who will hand the money over to Joan. Then you can talk to your man, and I will talk to Joan to make sure that she has the money. Then we will go on to get the rest." So Clifford Olson, he dictated his proposal, and the detective wrote it down on a single page in a sloppy longhand scrawl, and it read, "This is an undertaking of an agreement between the RCMP and Clifford Robert Olson. The following will be paid by the RCMP to Mrs. Joan Olson for the following information. $10,000 cash for each body of missing persons up to 7 bodies. $30,000 for information of 4 bodies which have already been recovered, which relate to the above 7 other missing persons. The agreement should be as undertaken shall be binding in law as to not disclose the information in this agreement to the Canadian press. The following missing persons are covered in this agreement: Judy Cosma, Darren Johnsrud, Raymond King, Simon Partington, Ada Court, Louise Chartrand, Christine Weller, Terry Lynn Carson, Colleen Dignault, and Sandra Wolfsteiner, and 1 identified female. Sigrun Arndt, a German student tourist, police weren't aware was missing. $10,000 will be paid to Mrs. Olson up to a total of the recovery of 7 bodies. Later, Olson called his wife Joan and said, "Honey, you're going to be rich." As a minister responsible for the legal system, Williams was required to approve what most considered a very real deal with the devil. If Williams didn't agree to the terms, he was told there was a chance that Olson might slip back onto the street to kill again. There wasn't a shred of evidence, the investigators said. The pact was the only way to ensure he was convicted. It was an excruciating decision. No one disputes that there is a secret ceremony to the Canadian judicial system, a subterranean marketplace where lawyers and prosecutors haggle over charges, plea bargains, and guarantees of immunity. There's a cardinal rule, however, in all such bargains. The criminal should never be allowed to profit. Crime should not pay. Williams and the police could not allow Olson to directly receive the money. That would be too great of an outrage. Within days, Olson was escorted to an office high in the old Vedrigis-roofed sun tower. He was not in handcuffs. He strutted around the 17th floor as if he were a celebrity, smoking a White Owl cigar and commanding a handful of lawyers, secretaries, his wife, and police. "Does your husband know what he is doing?" asked Joan's lawyer, Jim McNeely. She was catatonic and could only nod mutely. Olson put a hand on her shoulder and muttered, "What can I say, honey? I did it. It was the booze and pills." She cried. Olson told the lawyers how he wanted the money distributed. Some would pay their fees, some would go to his parents, and he wanted to ensure Joan and their baby son were looked after. He suggested his lawyer, Robert Shantz, write a book about the case called "Kiss Daddy Goodbye." The money was taken out and counted on the coffee table. Someone later said that the scene was so bizarre, he half expected a sulfurous explosion and Satan himself to appear. Imagine an honest-to-goodness blood money deal for bodies. Olson's family received the cash. In exchange, Williams was able to guarantee a first-degree murder conviction, ease the anxiety of the parents whose children remained officially missing, dispel the terror that gripped British Columbia, and end an enormously expensive police investigation. Olson traveled in a car with 4 detectives, followed by a dog car. Behind, there were usually 3 or 4 other vehicles carrying forensic specialists to handle the crime scenes. Corporal Mayle, holding a large tape recorder, sat in the back seat with Olson, who held a microphone. The killer wore a regulation RCMP hat as a disguise and dictated as they went, describing the locale and circumstances of each murder. It was as if he was a sports announcer, broadcasting play-by-plays, but with bodies instead. Television newscasts featured scenes of excavation teams draining suburban wetlands. Olson liked the forest-cloaked hills around Weaver Lake and the peaty bottomland north of River Road for disposing of his victims. One body was mummified by the time it was found. Others were so badly decomposed only pathologists could identify them. He reenacted each murder, and then police would call McNeely and release the required amount of money. The lawyer deposited it first in the Bank of Montreal, Helmer and Hastings in downtown Vancouver, but later transferred it offshore to protect it from police seizure. In the middle of recovering victims, Olson and the police would eat at local steakhouses where the murderer was able to eat sirloin steaks and baked potatoes. He kept scores of mementos to remind himself of each child suffering in death throes, trophies to validate his kills. While he awaited trial, Olson was the topic of conversation in every courthouse, police station, jail, and legal place in the province. He even called reporters to brag about the deal he struck and bitch about jail conditions. "I can't stand the treatment," he complained. I don't know how he can't stand it. I don't ever get to eat steak and potatoes. Anyway, the other prisoners tossed trash and lighted cigarettes at him. They shoved him when he passed. While his clothes were in storage, someone ripped the buttons off his suit and scrawled "baby fucker" on his shirt. "That suit cost $200, he whined. "The shirt, $60. I don't have to put up with this kind of shit. I think one would have fair treatment from the press. I want to be segregated from other inmates. I have to sleep on the floor. I have to live like a dog. I've got no running water. I've got no light in my cell. I'm locked up 22 hours a day. I get 1 hour exercise in the morning." Olson's whining generated front-page news, but nothing of the cash for bodies deal was mentioned. The Attorney General had personally wooed publishers and broadcast executives not to reveal the pact. Even when questions about the payoff were raised in the House of Commons, they censored the information. In the end, the trial was aborted by Olson's guilty pleas. He dabbed away tears as he confessed publicly for the first time. After the court clerk read each charge of first-degree murder, Olson replied hoarsely, "Guilty." Tears streamed down his cheeks after the 11th and final first-degree murder charge was read. Justice Harry McKay said no punishment a civilized country could impose was adequate. You should never be granted parole for the remainders of your days. It would be foolhardy to let you at large. Indeed, as he was driven away to serve his sentence, Olson confided to the accompanying officer that if he ever regained his freedom, I'd take up where I left off. News of the cash for bodies deal broke, and everyone was upset about it. The victims' parents were upset, the community was upset, everyone was upset, and it was they just thought it was disgusting that this murderer was profiting from his murders. Montreal criminal lawyer Frank Schuffy summed up the reaction of many in the legal community as the biggest judicial scandal in years. So, yeah. After families pleaded for readdressing this in court, the police tried unsuccessfully to recover the money. Joan Hill had said she cried. She cried a lot at first, but she didn't know how to explain it. "I really don't think too much about them now. I'm glad the children are buried. Oh, I hate him. I hated him for the night he held a knife to my throat. He terrorized me, scared me, beat me. There was no one I could turn to." The court let her keep the money. "I think that money was given to me in good faith," Hill said afterward. "I don't have a guilty conscience. I can look myself in the mirror and say, you are a good person. Don't be ashamed." When she looked back on why she got involved with Olson, she said, "He's a real charmer. He has a way with words, and I've yet to see a woman that hasn't been attracted to him. I don't know what it is, really. I like to say it was his brown eyes, but it couldn't have been that. It was something I thought I needed. I needed that companionship, I thought. And I needed someone to protect me from my husband because he was coming around and bothering me, and Clifford seemed the perfect solution." On her then 3-year-old son, named after his father, she said, "It's really strange. He knows who his father is. He picked it on from the TV. I just can't believe it. I just explained it to him that his dad was a bad person and he has to spend the rest of his life in jail, and that we are never going to see him, and he accepted that. Whether he will later on, I don't know." 5.5 years after Olson picked up Christine Weller and drove her to a dump by the Fraser River in Richmond, the Supreme Court of Canada refused an appeal from the parents to examine the deal. Even after he was locked away for the rest of his days, Olson continued to plague police, his victims, families, and the public. He claimed to have murdered as many as 30 others, but he was never able to substantiate these boasts, despite leading investigators on an embarrassing wild goose chase. Olson sent venomous, vulgar greeting cards to parents, crowing about his brutality to their children. He sent pornographic letters to members of Parliament. No one has managed to explain why Olson was the way he was, and no matter how ill he might have been, he never turned himself in. The man with the best insight was probably Stanley Simrow, a top forensic psychiatrist who interviewed Olson at length in prison. "He can kill, not out of anger or bitterness, but in a light-hearted way as a sport," Simrow testified at a judicial review when Olson applied for early parole. He doesn't even grasp the enormity or the horror of what he has done. Is a personality which is devoted to exploiting and harming other people in his own interests. Simrow described Olsen as an antisocial, narcissistic psychopath who boasted about his murders. He called him a master manipulator who exhibited homo and heterosexual pedophilia, sexual necrophilia, and sexual sadism. Olsen described with delight his sexual assaults of 30 to 40 children of both sexes, aged 5 to 10, as well as up to 100 young people aged 16 to 18. Olsen said he became addicted to murder and had an incredibly morbid fascination with how children went through the process of dying. Seeing the death process was something he took substantial pleasure in, said Simrow. His claims of remorse are completely hollow. In fact, he says he deserves substantial credit from the families because of the fact he so helped locate bodies. He used World War II as an analogy. He said, "We're friendly with the Germans and the Japanese now. Let's get over this, too. Let's not make such a big deal out of this." The killings have, in fact, been a plus in his life. He went essentially from a nobody to, in his own eyes, a somebody. It put him on the map. In his own eyes, he has a celebrity status. Olsen scored 38 out of 40 on the Hare checklist, which is a clinical scale that rates psychopaths. It was the highest score Simrow had ever given any of the hundreds of murderers, psychopaths, and sexual offenders he had studied. I found his descriptions to be quite nauseating compared to other cases I have been involved in. I'm really sorry, my dog is snoring so heavy right now. Simrow concluded Olsen was untreatable. He's very pleased with the way he is right now. The jury at the judicial review took only 15 minutes to order Olsen kept in jail. As with many psychopaths, there was virtually no traumatic event in his childhood that could be identified as the trigger of Olsen's homicidal rage. His parents became endured to the regular visits from police, the shame of the newspaper reports, and the continued disruption their son's behavior caused in their life. They tried to help when they could, but had long given up hope of rehabilitating him. They only aimed to limit the damage he had done in their lives. Both his father and his mother remained supportive until they died in 1988 and 1989. His sister and 2 brothers said they cut off all contact with him in 1989 too. "We were like moths around a flame," said McNeely, Jones' lawyer. "If there's an afterlife, I hope Olsen's confined to the 7th level of hell. He could pick up every vibe, every tick and feed it back to you. Mirror you exactly. The press has this image of Olsen as disheveled with beastly eyes, a monster. But he was a personable, charming guy. When he walked into my office, it was the cops that looked bad. Thankfully, he will do no more damage." Olsen very fully appreciated the nature and quality of what he was doing, said his former lawyer. That probably was the engine that drove him in terms of doing these murders. He had been free exactly 1,501 days from the time he was 17. Educated people pored over his history and could not find any reason that could have made him become like this. Moral imperatives were devoid of meaning for him, but he could perfectly enunciate them. He was aware of the rules, could repeat them parrot-like, but he held them in contempt. No one can say what creates or motivates such people as he. He seemed to suffer more from a condition akin to moral scurvy. It's what he didn't have, a conscience, that caused his pathology, as near as the specialists could tell. He may have even been born with a biological defect that left him unable to feel or appreciate what is truly important in life. He mimicked emotion as if he were a human chameleon. The root of the trouble wasn't hereditary, nor does it appear linked to upbringing. It remains an enigma. So now I'm going to read you a list of Olsen's victims including their profiles and the causes of death. Christine Weller. 12-year-old Christine was found murdered in Richmond on December 25, 1980. She was stabbed to death on November 19, 1980. Weller was driven to an area of Richmond where she was murdered by multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. She suffered 10 stab wounds to the chest and abdomen and 2 superficial slashes in the neck. She had a double perforation of the right ventricle of the heart and 4 penetrating wounds in the liver. Colleen Daignault. 13-year-old Daignault was murdered on April 15, 1981 in South Surrey near 144th Street and 26th Avenue. The deceased was picked up in Surrey and driven to a remote area of South Surrey where she was attacked and murdered by repeated hammer blows to the head. Actual cause of death was 2 depressed fractures of the occipital region of the skull. Darren Johnsrud. Johnsrud was 16 when he was murdered on April 21, 1981 in DeRoche. The deceased was picked up in New Westminster and driven to the DeRoche where he was murdered by repeated hammer blows to the head. Cause of death was comminuted skull fracture with right subdural hemorrhage, left hemothorax. Sandra Lynn Wolfsteiner. 16-year-old Wolfsteiner was murdered May 19, 1981 in the Chilliwack Lake area. The deceased was picked up at the bus stop in Surrey and driven to a remote area on the Chilliwack Lake Road where she was murdered by repeated hammer blows to the head. Few skeletal remains were found and cause of death was determined to be head injuries. Ada Anita Court. Ada was 13 years old when she was murdered on June 21, 1981 at Weaver Lake Road. The deceased was picked up while walking on North Road in Coquitlam and driven to a remote area near Weaver Lake where she was murdered by repeated hammer blows to the head. Skeletal remains with several depressed skull fractures were found. So, I guess he likes hammers. Simon Patrick James Partington. Partington was 9 years old when he was murdered on July 2, 1981 on Rivers Road, Nelson Avenue in Richmond. The deceased was picked up 2 blocks from his home in Surrey and given a ride. During the course of the ride, he was taken to a remote area of Richmond, given a couple bottles of beer, and then strangled. Julie Cosma. Cosma was 14 when she was murdered on July 9, 1981 near Weaver Lake. The deceased was picked up in New Westminster and driven to a remote area near Weaver Lake where she was murdered by multiple stab wounds. Raymond Lawrence King Jr. King was 15 when he was murdered on July 23, 1981 near Weaver Lake. The deceased was picked up at the bus depot after leaving the Manpower office in New Westminster and driven to a remote area near Weaver Lake. He was thrown down in an embankment and murdered while unconscious by rock blows to the head. Sigrun Charlotte Elizabeth Arndt. Arndt was 18 when she was murdered on July 24, 1981 at a remote area north of River Road in Richmond. The deceased was picked up in Coquitlam and driven to a remote area of Richmond where she was murdered by repeated hammer blows to the head and then thrown into a ditch with water to be buried. The cause of death was massive head injuries. Terry Lynn Carson. Carson was 15 when she was murdered on July 27, 1981 in a remote area east of Chilliwack. The deceased was picked up on 108th Avenue bus stop and driven to a remote area past Chilliwack where she was murdered by strangulation. Louise Simmons Marie Evelyn Chartrand. Chartrand was 17 when she was murdered on July 30th, 1981 near Whistler, British Columbia. The deceased was picked up walking to work in Maple Ridge, British Columbia and driven to the Whistler area where she was murdered by repeated hammer blows to the head. Her decomposed body was found with evidence of massive skull fractures. The above facts show Olsen preyed on the very young by gaining their friendship and then taking them to a remote part of British Columbia, where he murdered them by either strangulation, stabbing, or bashing their heads open with a hammer. I'm assuming he has a hammer just because he worked odd jobs and such, so he probably always had the hammer on him, so I bet that's why he used it a lot. And can you imagine using the hammer so up close and brutal? So is strangling, but and bashing a head in with a rock. It's all very, very close and personal. So, extremely wicked, evil man. While locked up with Olson in the prison in Kingston are a whole series of unanswered questions. How many other children had Olson drugged and murdered? Is Olson keeping quiet about these other murders to use at a later date as a bargaining tool? Would Olson have shown the RCMP where more bodies were buried if they had been allowed to offer him more money? Both the Mounties and BC Attorney General Williams admitted that Olson came up with another cash for bodies deal in the fall of 1981. The Mounties said the offer was rejected because they were acting under a policy directive from the Attorney General not to have any further cash talks with Olson. When Assistant RCMP Commissioner Don Wilson was asked by the Vancouver Sun whether he believed Olson could provide them with more bodies, the short answer is yes, said Wilson. They, the RCMP, had factual evidence upon which such a matter could be considered. Did Olson kill more kids? The RCMP believe that Olson is responsible or has information on several of the highway murders or gruesome series of unsolved sex slayings in British Columbia's interior and Alberta Rockies. A young woman named Pamela, in fact, was listed amongst the victims of the highway murders. Her full name was Pamela Lorraine Darlington, and her stripped, raped, and sexually mutilated body was found floating face down on November 1973 in the Thompson River at Kamloops, British Columbia. At least 14 young women were murdered between 1972 and 1981 on the Trans-Canada Yellowhead, or roads feeding into these main highways over the Canadian Rockies. The body of a 15th victim, Monica Jack, a 12-year-old Indian girl who was bicycling home on a country road when she went missing, was never found. All these women were fresh-faced, innocent-looking girls with young, petite bodies that appealed to Olson. Many were sexually used, and all were hitchhiking. The RCMP believe that Olson has a knowledge of 17 women and 6 young girls who were murdered in between the highway of Kamloops and Banff. The RCMP believe they were all murdered while hitchhiking. There were other murders, not included in the highway murders, which the RCMP believe bore the clear imprint of an Olson killing. The body of one of these girls, 17-year-old Verna Jerky from the tiny Fraser Canyon community of Yale, BC, was never found. Verna was working the night shift as a waitress at the Godfather, a steak and pizza restaurant in Hope, BC, when she went missing. Verna did not have a car and often worked late, so would a lot of times either hitchhike or stay at a friend's house. On October 9th, 1981, more than 5 months after Verna went missing, some personal articles of hers were found in what police call an area of mountain, Buston River beside Highway 7, just 3 miles west-east of Hope, BC, where Clifford liked to take many of his victims along this same highway before turning off into the bush and murdering them. Superintendent Larry Polk of RCMP believed the killing of Verna had all the trademarks of an Olson murder: a young, attractive girl, hitchhiking in one of Olson's favorite stopping-off points, and it was just Olson's style to scatter his victims' personal effects in remote bushes to confuse investigators. Another slaying which the RCMP said had the stamp of Olson was that of Mary Ellen Jamison, who disappeared on August 7, 1980, on the beautiful Sunshine Coast just north of Vancouver City. The pretty blue-eyed blonde was last seen hitchhiking on Highway 101 at Davis Bay on Vancouver Island. Mary was on her way home after having dinner with her boyfriend, 18-year-old Adrian Dixon, in Sechelt. She was hitchhiking because there was no bus service, and her only alternative would be a $15 cab fare or ride with family or friends. Her family knew something was terribly wrong when she did not return home by 11 p.m. Her body was found 9 days later by 3 family friends off of a logging road near the bay around 12 miles from her own home. RCMP and searchers had been down the road before, and there was nothing that could be seen from a car, but a 17-year-old named Todd Redmond had a feeling this was a spot. They stopped the car, and he grabbed a shovel and started digging in the gravel alongside the road. Even though there were no signs that the ground had been disturbed, the youth was convinced that Marnie was there. She was lying fully clothed with bruise marks around her neck where she had been strangled. Clifford Olson knew the Vancouver area like the back of his hand, and 3 of his known victims had been strangled. He also liked to leave his victims, like Marnie, on back roads. It is kind of weird that that kid knew the exact spot. I kind of question that. Other murder Olson has knowledge of include possibly some of the Green River murders in the U.S., and he has actually been given immunity from prosecution in Washington state in return for him offering to reveal whereabouts of supposed 5 bodies that were sexually raped and then murdered. And the U.S. authorities and the RCMP also know Olson can provide them with details of 23 more bodies in 6 U.S. states: Florida, Louisiana, Oregon, California, Illinois, and New York. Olson claims he was on vacation in each of these states while on parole from the BC penitentiary. Olson didn't confess to the murders, his lawyer stated. All he said was that he had information on the whereabouts of 5 murdered bodies. The then Attorney General of Alberta, the Honorable Neil Crawford, received a letter dated March 25, 1983 from Olson claiming he had information pertaining to 3 young girls that were raped and murdered, and that one of their bodies had already been recovered. He also sent letters about these victims to other important people. But because of the ongoing investigation into this matter, that nothing can be said about it or made public. But it can be noted, though, that one of the victims was a 19-year-old Vietnamese girl who was employed at the Banff Hotel where Olson stayed. Olson also claimed to have knowledge of the following case. In the summer of 1978, on August 12th, 21-year-old Deborah Silverman, who lived in the apartment block building on Bathurst Street in Toronto, went missing. Her car was parked in the northwest corner of the lot behind the apartment block, and her purse, lace-trimmed panties, and a broken gold necklace were found inside the back door. On Sunday, November 12, 1978, her body was found in a lot on a farm at an intersection of Highway 7 at Durham Regional Road 13 in the Brock Township, about 42 miles east of York. Her hands were tied behind her back with the sleeves of her blue and white shirt, and her black halter top was around her neck. Her brassiere was still on, but she had no shoes or underpants on. Olson claims to have been there and know the person who killed her and says he can provide pictures. But he refused to talk about it when he was not offered any deals. He probably wanted more money again. Clifford Olson died in prison on October 3rd, 2011, at age of 71. And here are some intriguing details that have been learned about him. One thing is that he is a good study. He breaks the norms of what a serial killer is supposed to be. As a child, he did not bedwet, he did not start fires, and he did not torture animals. He did have a dysfunctional family life, but his sister and brother were normal. Another detail, for each of the 11 young people he killed and raped, Olson wrote detailed 50-page accounts with a foreword to each that were to be given to his son when the boy reached 20 in 2000. And a book called The Predator has been written based on these letters to his son. So I guess if you want to read that, you can get that book. And I guess it describes in deep detail how he did his rapes and murders of these kids. So other details about Olsen is that he acknowledges that the death penalty should apply to him, and that if he was freed, he'd likely kill again without knowing why he killed in the first place. He went through a homosexual marriage in prison, but is not homosexual. Sex to him was sex. Gender was unimportant. He chose his victims carefully. Most kids came from broken homes and were considered runaways. He even killed them in different ways, sometimes bludgeoning or stabbing or throttling, sometimes all three. Out of curiosity more than malice, he once pounded a nail into the head of a drugged victim, a Phillips screwdriver into the skull of another. Then he questioned them on how it felt. He was furious when one boy he raped told him he'd been sodomized before. Olsen scolded him for not telling the police, then killed him. FBI great profiler John Douglas was consulted about Olsen. Douglas was curious about him and said it was extremely unlikely that Olsen would have started killing at age 40 and likely had started 20 years earlier. And then looking back into the 1960s, there were missing and murdered kids in BC that Olsen claimed he'd killed. He believes this to be true and thinks that what saved him from being arrested and for these crimes was that he was jailed for other things while the hunt was going on for the murderers. Also, after trying several religions in prison, Olsen finally decided he was a Catholic. He received an encouraging letter from the papal nuncio when he wrote to the Pope about the remorse he felt for his crimes. When Douglas asked him about his revived Catholicism, he replied, "It's a great fucking religion. They'll forgive you for anything." When Douglas asked him about if he compares himself to Hannibal Lecter from when The Silence of the Lambs came out, Olsen said, "There's no comparison. Hannibal Lecter's fiction. I'm real." Douglas thinks Olsen is destined to die in prison, which he did. So that is Clifford Robert Olsen. He is a child murderer, rapist, and probably has tons more out there that have not yet to be identified as being done by him. And this will finally end episode 5, so I will start on new topics and always come back to this because there's so many. Anyway, have a good evening.